Welcome back to another episode of the MGA Library Podcast. I am once again Zach Brigman. My name has not changed yet. I don't think, unless I have amnesia tomorrow. I am today joined by a person that we have already interviewed, Ann Williams, but a new person in a new discipline, Dr. Andrew Reeves. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Yourself?
I'm a little tired. I'm ready to go home and go to bed again.
That'll do. That'll do.
I think we're all ready for spring break.
Oh, yeah.
Very much so.
Yep, we're recording the week before spring break. So this episode, we're going to talk about generically what history is and what it means to society. So let's talk about your professional background.
Okay. I have a PhD from the University of Toronto's Centre for Medieval Study. I am a medievalist, that is a scholar of medieval history, although medievalists also study medieval literature, medieval philosophy, medieval liturgy, etc., etc., etc. My scholarship, that's my research, is on church history and in particular on pastoral care. That is, how lay people received religious instruction and guidance from lower ranked clergy, from your parish priests, from your friars, and that sort of thing. So my book is on religious education in 13th century England, an effective and non-narcotic sleeping aid. And I basically look at Sunday school 800 years ago. People who went to church a long time ago.
Cool. Do we have a copy of that in our library?
We do, yes.
Oh, okay. It's going to be under the faculty collection?
Yes, there's a copy in the faculty collection. There's also, I think, a copy on the shelf in Macon, and there might be one on the shelf here. And we also have it electronically.
Oh, okay. That's cool.
Not that I have vaingloriously looked for copies of my book in our library.
When I was a history student, it was always cool to go to the history section and be like, I know that professor.
Yes. And as the, Ann Williams, Assistant Director of Library Services, working with our collections librarian to make sure that we do support faculty scholarship, do provide copies of faculty publications when we are made aware of them, as Dr. Reeves has so kindly alerted us whenever he's had publications. We encourage other faculty and other individuals within the university community to let us know when you've published something so that we can make sure that we support that not only for you as the author, but also for the enrichment of our entire community.
Yeah.
So,
All right, let's get into it. How is history defined?
So I think I want to start by defining history with saying what it's not. Or rather saying what our starting point is, which many people confuse for the end of the journey. So we often think of history as this happened and that happened. A bare recitation of facts about the past, especially if our familiarity with history is the board coach teaching out of the book and you have the key terms you need to learn at the beginning of each chapter of the U.S. history book. And while the foundation of the study of history is the raw facts, what happened, when it happened, history is much more than that. And in fact, for the entire historical tradition in Western history writing, going all the way back to the 5th century BC, history entails not just what happened, but an analytical study of the past. What happened, but then looking more deeply. Why did things happen? How did things happen? What changes? Are there social and political constants? We can ask things like the reliability of sources. We can ask about previous interpretations from historians in our own day that might have changed based on present circumstances. So I'd like to think of history as an analytical approach to the past based on an in-depth study of primary and secondary sources. And for our listeners, I think most of them will know what primary sources are, but just in case, primary sources are those texts that come from around or near the time of the event in question. They can be just about anything. It can be a journal, a newspaper article, a wall painting, an archaeological record. Those are primary sources. Secondary sources are what historians write up once they have analyzed the primary sources and, of course, other secondary sources.
Okay. So, let's see, how do I word this? I ADD's working overtime right now. Because now it's like turning into other things.
Yeah.
So, would you consider history almost interdisciplinary, where like you have to rely on psychology to kind of understand the thought process of the day, or do you...
Oh, absolutely. And I am being perhaps a bit of a disciplinary imperialist by saying in many ways, so many of the disciplines can be handmaidens to history because, of course, you need to have at least a bare knowledge of literary conventions when you're working with primary sources. You might also branch out into, for example, art historical work. If you have enough data, you might be drawing on the tools of the social sciences. And in fact, history is much, much richer when one draws on the methodology of other sources. In my own field, we've seen folks like Carolyn Walker Bynum take anthropology and apply that to medieval Europe and yield incredible insights, because normally historians, when they had just been focusing on political history or political and intellectual history, hadn't really thought through the analysis of how humans work in groups that cultural anthropologists do. So yes, history done right is an interdisciplinary field.
Okay.
Yeah. Which I appreciate you bringing that up, both Zach and Dr. Reeves, because I hope that one of the ways that I can contribute to the conversation is that before I became a librarian, my academic background was in humanities, which was a disciplinary field at the program that I was at. And so I took courses in history, in art history, in literature, in lots of different fields to get that cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary aspect. So to see how all of these different fields work together, complement each other to provide that larger context that enriches so much of academia. So, I appreciate the fact that Dr. Reeves mentioned that, looking in your field and becoming a specialist and an expert in your own discipline is fantastic, but also to be aware of the larger conversation about what other fields have going on or what they have to contribute is very valuable as well.
Like how Chaucer, his Canterbury Tales can kind of give you an insight of how the people, the social classes that are mentioned in it, how they live their lives. Almost.
Oh, absolutely. And just also even little details can tell us about the intellectual background. So one thing that you see in the study of history with the Annales School, this school of history founded in the 20th century by French historians from working and publishing the journal Annales d'Histoire, and I don't remember the rest of the French. And they looked oftentimes at mentalities, about the mental furniture of people in the past and how it shifts over a long period of time. And something like the Canterbury Tales is going to be super useful because obviously it's not a source of things that happened, but it really helps situate the mental furniture of the people of the time. And I talk a lot about mentalities. That's this mental furniture. Because we all have mentalities in our own world. We walk at the door. We believe that the earth travels around the sun. We believe that the natural sciences explain the world. We don't think about this all the time, but it's always part of our mental furniture. And in the same way, you've got a mental furniture of every age and period, and it shifts over time. So literary texts really help with that.
Reeves is a Galileo disciple. I believe that Earth is revolved by the sun.
Galileo is one of these really fascinating stories that I'm going to kind of launch into. I'm going to grab this because Galileo's story is so much more fascinating than a lone scientist standing up to religious obscurantism, because the story of why he gets condemned is, yes, his writing about a heliocentric world and his use of a telescope to show empirically that the Copernican model is correct. Yeah, that's one thing that gets him in trouble. But he would have been fine if he had been having an argument had not a couple of things happened. One, the atmosphere of the Counter-Reformation, when there's a greater paranoia and rigidity in Catholic thought in response to Protestant Christianity in Northern Europe. But even more important, the Pope had been protecting Galileo from enemies that he had within the church. And the Pope asked him, for the sake of diplomacy, to simply present heliocentrism as a theory, a possible theory. And so he wrote his Dialogue of Two World Systems. And the defender of the geocentric system, which he presents as clearly wrong, is a man named Simplicio.
Yeah.
And Simplicio, which could roughly translate as to dull-witted guy, who is saying, well, I'm not very smart, and it seems to me that the sun travels around the earth, was also modeled on the Pope.
Didn't have to use that accent, but okay.
Yeah. I am a native Southerner, so I can do that. We're allowed to do that.
It's a choice.
So, the story then, of course, is that once the Pope sees that Galileo is annoyedly making fun of him, of course the Pope withdraws his protection, and Galileo grumbles and recants his teaching. And so the story of Galileo, yes, it's a story of a teaching that gets into trouble, but it's also a story of a guy who is definitely probably smarter than everyone around him and knows it, but doesn't quite have the good sense to know when to read the room, when to use diplomacy, when it would be a better idea to smile and work within the system rather than intentionally making people upset.
Poking the bear.
Galileo may have been on the spectrum.
We will never know, but it is interesting to consider.
But I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because that is one of my favorite stories to tell.
It is a great story.
to learn about,
It's not really about how it was the church saying, like, oh, you're going against God. It's like,
It's
hey,
more complex than
it's
that.
more complex. And then him just going like, okay, you're just too stupid. Okay? It's just... And there was a whole theory, a conflict theory that came out of that as well, that science and religion doesn't mix, which could be a podcast episode that we could talk about later on.
Well, that's one of my pet peeves. That's really more of an 18th, 19th century thing. The idea of science and religion really comes out starting from French Enlightenment, and then kind of picks up and moves from there with your logical positivists in the 19th century.
Okay, well, that's an episode that we definitely will need to talk about, because that's fascinating to me. Another question, and it deals more with professional, like history professors. Are y'all required to study multiple periods of history, or do y'all have like a laser focused?
Depends on the historian. When you're getting your PhD, that is, when you're becoming a big people scholar, you generally have a major field of study that is fairly narrowly focused. In my particular department, it was really narrowly focused, pastoral care in the 13th century. In a history department, it might be more broadly focused, like medieval intellectual history. Oftentimes, though, historians will also, in their graduate training, have a minor field. So a historian might be a Europeanist trained in intellectual history and then have a minor field in post-colonial Africa. And the minor field is both to have a broader way of thinking and also to make one a little bit more marketable. So one can say when one is looking for a job, I am not hyper-focused. I can teach multiple things.
Exactly.
So graduate school, though, does give you something of a hyper-focus, especially when you're writing your thesis. But after that, historians will often have a freedom to branch out past their field of study. Although oftentimes we do kind of stick with the security blanket in what we publish. Now, for myself, I tend to still largely publish in 13th century English religious life, but I teach at Middle Georgia State here, and we're a smaller school, and so we necessarily have to branch out. So, for example, I specialize in medieval history. I also, even at an upper level, teach early modern history. I teach ancient history. I take my teaching on, or my research on the history of Christianity, but also then teach more broadly on religious history more generally. And likewise, my colleague Larry Israel, he's a specialist in Ming China, but he teaches upper level classes on the history of Japan, of modern East Asia. And then, of course, needs of teaching means that Americanists will teach both halves of the U.S. History Survey, up through 1873, then 1873 through present. And here in Middle Georgia, non-Americanists will teach world history to 1600 and then post-1600. Some schools will have a world history sequence and a Western civilization sequence and a U.S. history sequence. We don't. We're a smaller school, and Georgia has a world history sequence versus Western civilization. Alabama does Western civilization rather than world history for them. And they also do world history, but they're kind of other than U.S. major sequences, Western civ. So it varies from school to school. And in a place like Athens, if I were in Athens, I would teach 2 classes, and I would mainly teach the first half of the World History Survey and probably just classes on medieval Europe.
Athens,
But
Georgia, right?
yes, Athens,
Greece.
Georgia.
Athens, Georgia.
We have a worldwide audience, I guess. So yes, let me specify Athens, Georgia.
We should not have named all our cities after capitals.
Oh, it's fine. It's fine. But yeah, I think that Dr. Reeves' observation about the specificity when you're going through graduate school can also be applied towards other disciplines, because we've had numerous conversations with some of our English faculty, and they've talked about their research interests and specializations, but then I think briefly talked in several of the conversations about what they end up teaching depending on the needs of the institution.
Yes.
And that can also vary by time and the membership of the faculty. So if you have a specialist who's been teaching one sequence for a decade or so, and then they retire or leave the institution, then you have a gap where you need to hire a faculty member who can teach those specialty areas and fill the needs of the institution. So things can shift over time, but it is really nice when faculty members can, cater a little bit to their specialty and their expertise areas and kind of piggyback a little bit to continue that research on, but also fill the needs of the institution and to really broaden students' minds in those areas.
And one advantage about being in a smaller teaching-focused university like Middle Georgia is it forces all of us to be at least something of a generalist. And it makes me a much stronger historian because by virtue of teaching not just lower level classes on global history, but even upper level classes reaching from medieval all the way into early modern or all the way back into ancient, it makes me a better historian because I can't just stick with my security blanket of medieval Europe.
So a smaller school helps you with your faculty development.
Yes, absolutely. Helps me think much more broadly.
Oh, that's awesome. Is history misunderstood by people? Because you always see the Facebook posts of like things history class didn't teach you, or
oh gosh, there are so many ways.
that annoys my dad, by the way. So it's like his school things they didn't teach you in history class. It's like they didn't teach you that because that's not what it's supposed to be in K through 12.
Oh my goodness, there are so many misconceptions about history. So one thing, though, is as I have, I think, matured as a historian and a public servant, because we do all draw a paycheck from the state of Georgia, is my thinking has sort of evolved with respect to misconceptions. When I was younger, I was very, very disdainful to what I call dad histories or Barnes and Noble histories, stories of greatest generals of World War II, or stories of
Popular history.
Pop history. Yes, history that you'll, when you're in Books A Million or in Barnes & Noble, you'll find in the history section. And I would say that history is definitely more than just exciting stories about the past. So a misconception about history is that it's the story of great men and generals and heroes and politicians, and that is some of history, and yet history is so much more than that. But if if I were 10 years younger, I would be talking about how this style of history gives a wrong impression. As I think an older and wiser historian, I think that the Barnes & Noble type history, the dad histories, can be an entry point into a deeper study of history. So, minor misconceptions is that history is simply the story of great men and women, heroes and generals. That's a minor misconception. I think greater misconceptions are the ideas of, one, history is written by the victors. Two, that there are secret histories that they, capital T, are concealing.
Them.
Now, this is a pet peeve of mine because I was doing my PhD in the 2000s when, as you might remember, a movie called The Da Vinci Code came out.
Yes.
And so I would talk to people when they'd say, what do you do? And I would say, I am writing a PhD in medieval history, and I look at churchmen's books. And they would immediately ask, what are the secret texts that the Vatican is suppressing? And I would grit my teeth and say, there aren't any secret texts. And in fact, there's a real misconception. We talk about the secret archive of the Vatican. That's a language issue. It's not the secret histories that the Catholic Church is suppressing. It just means the private archive, the secretary's archive, right? A secretary keeps your private information. Secretary. Secret
So
archive.
it's like the internal memos and
Yes, exactly. So one huge conception is that there are secret facts that are being concealed. And that can have its genesis in a correct understanding of history. Because very obviously, when we learn history in elementary school, we learn a fairly basic form of history that's meant to inculcate good citizenship. You know, we learn about Washington and MLK and Lincoln, and we
important
generally,
people.
yeah, and we generally learn the high points. We generally learn the Yay America. By high school, when you start to get more complicated, frankly, lots of people have the adolescent hormone dump going on, and what they're reading in their history book or what the history coach is teaching them is the farthest thing from their mind. So you'll often hear, we didn't learn this in history, and in fact, you did learn this in history, but you were more concerned about getting laid high, or whatever. Maybe cut that out in post, but but because you've often checked out by the time history gets more complicated, you get an impression that things are being suppressed. So secret histories are a really common misconception, and that's really kind of my pet peeve. Because frankly, historians don't want to keep secrets. If you find out something that has been unknown for a long period of time, you're going to immediately try to get that published.
It's exciting. People
Yeah.
are like, oh, this is cool.
Yeah, exactly. And as the spouse of a high school social studies teacher for over a decade, I have learned by having conversations with him that there are also constraints in that K-12 environment as far as required things that the state boards of education require you to cover. So there's not enough time in the school year or in the school day to cover everything that they might be wanting to cover. So it's like it's introducing you, giving you a taste, hopefully igniting that interest in the field so you will pursue further on your own, hopefully through your local library, whether it's the school library or the public library, that, you know, igniting that fire of interest. So my husband does a lot of storytelling in class. He teaches world history primarily, so he's covering a lot of time frame period when it comes to it. So he's going at a pretty rapid pace, but trying to introduce students to the concept, saying, you know, if you're interested in this, there's more available out there for you.
Right. 9 months to cover all of human history is a little bit of an ask.
Exactly.
Which rolls into another question. Is it possible to know all history?
Oh, gosh, no. That's an easy one. I wish. I do like my students to at least come away from world history with a sense of the broad brush strokes that they can then delve into further. Now, I philosophically differ with some of my colleagues. Some of my colleagues have an idea of teaching world history whereby you don't try to give the broad brush strokes of the big picture because it's considered a fool's errand, because it's not possible to know all history. And so there are very reasonable disagreements here. Some of my colleagues will take certain periods and do a much deeper dive and maybe not try to cover everything or the big picture. I take a different approach. It varies. It's almost a kind of personal taste, personal approach. Both have their strengths and weaknesses. I mean, for example, when I teach world history, I would like a student to come away at least knowing, for example, with respect to Chinese history, that the major dynasties were the Shang, Zhou, Qin that unifies Han, Tang, Ming, Qing. You know, 6 major dynasties, and the basic features of those, the ones that lasted 300 or 400 years. Because there's a lot of different dynasties in China that I don't know because I'm not a Sinicist, I'm a Europeanist. But I want them to know the broad strokes. I would like students to be able to understand the basics of what characterize medieval and early modern history in Europe and the Middle East. I would like them to have the big picture that then they can dig into more on their own.
The first dynasty was actually the Ji dynasty,
Right,
which is a mythical founding.
Yeah, and that's why I don't really. That's why I didn't mention Xia. Like Xia, Shang, Zhou is obviously the first 3, but
it's a cool story.
Yeah,
Of how the founding of the first dynasty was.
Yeah.
It was made because the dude figured out how to make the Yellow River
It's
not
flood
flood.
control.
Yeah, it was flood control. He was an architect. And they were like, you're now a king.
Well,
And
it's
like-
fascinating because compared to the Middle Eastern notion of a great flood that has either an Utnapishtim or a Noah riding out the flood through an ark, in the Chinese version you have a story of stopping the great flood by means of bureaucracy and infrastructure.
Which was probably because Chinese history is so much about bureaucracy, so that makes sense that they would want their founding myth to be like, oh, us bureaucrats, we've been doing this the whole time.
Well, one fascinating thing when I teach history of world religions, I frankly have no business teaching about Dharmic religions and Taoism and Confucianism. But again, I mentioned my philosophy is to go for coverage. And when I teach histories of world religions, I talk about Taoism, and I mentioned that by the period that Europeanists call the Middle Ages, Taoists are thinking of heaven in terms of a bureaucracy, which kind of blows students' minds in that, because they're familiar usually with the Abrahamic faith traditions.
I recommend, if any students are watching, I recommend taking Dr. Israel's early Chinese history because it's so fascinating. You learn things that you didn't expect. Like,
absolutely, I cannot recommend my colleague Larry Israel's classes highly enough.
I didn't know about the spring and autumn period before I took that class. I was like, there was a period before that?
Yes.
It's like, holy crap. Is our understanding of history always in a state of flux? Like, are there parts of, like, let's say, the Civil War that we're finding out? Stuff about, like, World War II, World War I.
So in many ways, this happened, then that happened element of history is more stable than the interpretive element. Not completely stable. New sources come to light. Not as often as we'd like, but new sources will come to light, and we can revise our understanding of the past based on those new sources. But those are often few and far between. However, our interpretation and our understanding of the past, that varies greatly by time and by period. That varies greatly by time and period. And often it does vary based on the priorities of the present. So when I teach the historiography part of methods, I note that with the rise of second wave feminism in the 60s and 70s, historians began to look in the past and focus more on women's history. With the rise of third wave feminism in the 90s, historians began focusing more on how societies in the past construct gender, the social element of sex. And those are two examples that come to mind. So our understanding is always in flux based on the present. And sometimes we can end up being too presentist if we really want to make history serve the needs of the present. But often changing social attitudes will help us go back and look at things that we might not have thought about or we might have just completely overlooked.
Are there any skills gained from studying history, like critical thinking, for example?
So, I would say that from the purely cynical perspective, historical research does make one employable in that one gains the skill set to do self-supervised tasks over a long period of time. And this is a useful tool to signal to human resources when one is looking for employment. This is why a history major is useful beyond just understanding the past as being really freaking cool. So a big part of the skills you learn is, one, is research, is how to evaluate what you're reading, is how to understand what is useful. You learn time management. A research paper simply cannot be done on a Sunday night of the due date. Well, it can be done well. It can be done, but it will be a C- research paper.
I can attest.
And so a research paper shows that you can synthesize information, but it also shows that you can be given a task in a length of time and do it on your own. It shows cognitive capacity to be able to not just read, but read for comprehension, to analyze, to put material together. And so for basic skills in the world, yes, study of history builds critical thinking. We always like using that word, but it does show an ability to kind of sort through sources, make sense of them, put them together, shows time management, shows a reasonable level of cognitive ability. For all these reasons, the study of history is useful for both well-rounded citizens and also members of the workforce contributing to the GDP.
Absolutely.
Are there other things that we are meant to learn from history? Like, are we meant to learn mistakes not to do and all that?
That's...
Because you always hear that thrown around. It's like, don't forget the mistakes in history.
So a friend of mine once put it this way. He said, history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it does rhyme badly like a Nicki Minaj song. And that joke is starting to get a little bit outdated, but I'm going to use it I'm going to flog that joke as long as it'll last. And
it's a good joke.
history shows patterns.
Patterns, exactly.
What can we learn from them? It depends. Can we learn lessons? Well, yes. But we've always got to be careful about what lessons we draw. A famous example, I think, is, for example, the Johnson administration in the Vietnam War. The Republic of Vietnam didn't have a lot of popular buy-in among Vietnamese people for a lot of reasons. And for that reason, it was probably not really sustainable to maintain an indefinite counterinsurgency in a liberal democratic state, because liberal democratic states don't tolerate high casualties indefinitely. But the thing is, the lesson the Johnson administration was taking from history was that in Munich, what had happened, the Allies had not initially stood up to another illiberal opponent, that is Nazi Germany, and it had just led to a larger war down the line. And so it was very good thinking on the part of the Johnson administration. Line has to be drawn here. You cannot appease an illiberal ideology that's looking to expand. That ended up, though, with it ended up as something of a sunk cost fallacy. So sometimes you can learn the wrong lessons. Sometimes you can fail to learn lessons, and these lessons can be with respect to politics, how people behave in groups. But in addition to lessons from history, and we can also learn, I think we can learn good lessons. We can learn, if we look at, for example, the 19th century, we can say, how does a country successfully industrialize? So if one is a consultant working with a developing country, one might look at, for example, how does Britain become the first nation to industrialize? Or you can look at, for example, Meiji Japan and say, how does a country crash industrialize? You can look at, and then you can look at the 20th century and you can say, what are the failures of crash industrialization? E.g., the Great Leap Forward. So there's lots of different lessons you can learn. Another thing that is useful, though, is, I think, to understand the institutions that we inhabit, whether things like the university, the church, the state, to understand that they have roots and that they are themselves historically contingent. They are the product of historical development. Why do universities exist? Why does the state of Georgia exist in so many counties? Why do liberal democratic states function the way they do? Even questions of why does the American South look the way it does in terms of racial distribution? And that one is interesting because you can go all the way back to 8th century Iraq and look at how, once people start looking at the model of a plantation-based economy using unfree workers, largely drawn from the enslaved from Africa, that became a self-sustaining thing. So we can understand the institutions we inhabit as a way of thinking about why they exist. Can they be made better? Or perhaps we should maintain them because they were put in place for very specific reasons.
Okay, well, that's pretty interesting. Do you have any advice on studying and understanding history for prospective students?
So for prospective students studying history, I would recommend read broadly. Read broadly, be a magpie. Do not simply focus on one period or thing. And I say this because when I was in undergrad, I just wanted to do medieval history, maybe late antiquity. And I have found later on that studying history more broadly, one, leads me to a lot more interesting things, leads me to make connections that I might otherwise have missed. So, one, be a magpie. Read broadly. Study broadly. If you are studying history, it would, once again, to be cynical and job market oriented, it would not hurt to pick up a teaching certificate. And in fact, it would be much better to have more enthusiastic students of history teaching history at a secondary level. Coaches are great. We need them to help train our athletes to be healthy in body and mind and to learn the values of teamwork and competition. And yet, it is also useful to have people teaching history who are there because they are fascinated by it, because they love it, and not simply because there's not enough money in the county budget for a full-time coach, so we have to give him a history job. So I would highly recommend get yourself a teaching certificate. It's also, to again be cynical, a good employment fallback. Primary and secondary education is always hiring. Another thing I might recommend is, if you are in a program like ours that has it, maybe look into public history. Getting a public history certification. You need not make that your whole focus, but to have enough focus of that means that you can work in fields that are public facing. And when I say public history, I mean things like living history, things like museums. But this can also be not just museums, things like archival work. There are a great many local cities and counties that need archivists. And that's not just for Americanists. I know a medievalist who works on some very similar material to myself, Ilya Deans, and he works for the Library of Congress in their medieval manuscripts division. So having if it's available in your program, working on enough public stuff that this is likewise employable for you, and keep your focus broad though. That's my main word of advice. Focus broadly.
Yeah, I took that lesson to heart so we have to get our bachelor's in history at Middle Georgia, we have to have a certain number of American history classes and a certain number of non-American history classes. I had the option of doing African classes or European classes. And I went, I know a lot about European. I don't know much about African. So I'm going to take those. And that just broadened my horizon.
Oh my goodness, when I was an undergrad, for our non-European, non-US requirement we had to take, I wanted to do traditional China, but in a school like UT Austin that's constantly at absolute capacity and classes fill as soon as they open, it was already full. So I took Mexico from Aztlan to Zapata, A to Z, Aztlan to Zapata.
That's funny.
Turns out that I was trying to find out what had become of the professor, and it turned out he was deceased. He died very young. Anyway, digression. But I found the Mexican history class to be so incredibly fascinating. And as someone with an interest in medieval history, it was also fascinating to look at especially colonial New Spain and to realize that you have so much of late medieval Spain feeding into colonial Mexico that it also made me a better medievalist and helped give me a broader understanding of that. And I learned a lot more about one of our largest trading partners and neighbors to the south that I would otherwise have been not completely ignorant of, but much more ignorant of. So yes, study broadly. You will find out all kinds of fascinating things.
We do have a study of a course on Central America or Latin America, and we did that as well. And we learned about a Catholic priest who was rising up against colonial Spain, and he gathered up
Father Hidalgo?
I think that was his name. And then it was peaceful to a point until they reached a city that had, what are they called?
Presidio?
Militia? The Spaniards that came over.
Criollos. Well, Criollos are Spaniards born in the Americas. Peninsulares are the ones who were Iberian born.
Yeah, Iberian born, yeah.
Yes, Peninsulares.
Well, they herded them all into a granary and set it on fire, and he went like, okay, this has gone far enough.
Yes.
It's fascinating. And the Comienda system was fascinating as well, how it was brought over because of how the Reconquista worked.
Yes.
Oh, the Reconquista was a fascinating point.
But you can absolutely see the Reconquista working just consistently in the background of your conquistadores. I mean, they'll even sometimes talk about Mesoamerican temples as mosques because that's their mental framework for unbeliever religion. Yeah, Reconquista just feeds into so much of the ideology of...
And not only that, colonial Spain was a three-way battle between the crown, the church, and the colonists. Because the colonists were like, we don't want anything to do with you. We're just going to do our own thing. And the church of Spain at that point wanted to recreate Utopia. Who wrote that? Francis Bacon? No?
Less is...
More.
Yeah. Nice. Very nice. Very nice, yeah.
They wanted to recreate that in the Americas, and Crown just wanted money.
Part of that is also that at the end of the day, though, the conquistadors, the crown tried to keep them on a short leash. But you've got the Atlantic Ocean.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
I mean, the communication barrier, the time delays in communication, when you had to send a ship across the ocean to be able to deliver messages, you kind of have a little bit more autonomy. The same thing for the American colonies.
The fact that the
British.
Spanish crown was able to maintain such a tight level of control is genuinely impressive with 16th, 17th century technology. Although you mentioned the American parallel, I think a really fascinating parallel is once you replace the Habsburgs with the Bourbons, the Bourbons attempt to. There's a lot of really useful reforms they attempt. They create, first off, the mission system in Texas and California to try to actually get these parts that they would consider waste because they don't think about natives as really being, especially natives who aren't in an urban environment like this Mesoamerica, as being really, actual proper subjects. You also see the Bourbons try to put your elites under a much tighter leash. And again, the end result of that, though, is as in the U.S., is when you realize that there's been this kind of process of neglect and you try to claw back privileges across the Atlantic Ocean, it ends up becoming an iffy proposition.
Yeah. That rebellion, when you don't already have that structure in place that you're able to control and regulate and maintain that structure, once people start to realize, I have a bit of autonomy and a bit of freedom, that I can make my own independent decisions without anybody having to reap the repercussions of it.
Right, and then when you try to claw that back, it's often very difficult.
Yes.
An interesting story about that. The crown tried to outlaw encomiendas, where when the last heir dies, the crown gets the land. And so they sent message to the viceroy of Peru, and the colonists went no, and they killed the viceroy in Peru. And the viceroy in Mexico heard that. He's like, I didn't get a message. and so he sent a message back to the crown saying that took, I think it was 6 months to get back. So he sent another message going I didn't get a message. And they're like, you need to do this. And he's I didn't get a message.
Exactly.
And did that because he's I'm not getting my head chopped off. Colonial history was very fascinating because there are so many comedies that happen.
Yeah. I just wish I had more of the research chops to look more at colonial New Spain and Peru, because that's the sort of thing that I find interesting and will occasionally teach on it when I do Atlantic history, but it's something that I wish I had more time to research, because
especially the treasure hunters.
Not just that, but the fact that the Philippine Islands are governed from Mexico City, which itself is governed from from Madrid, and the fact that it works, and
it's like a relay.
and that it works. That you have incidents where, and this is just not me being my rigorous historian, but this is so cool. But you have, for example, in the early 17th century, when New Spain goes to war with Brunei, and try to imagine in the freaking jungles of Borneo when you have Turks and Aztecs and samurai and Spaniards all at war on this far into the world. And it's often so little known. It kind of passes without thought among most North Americans.
It's like a weird battle royale fiction where all these people from different cultures are put into a pot and everybody fight.
Well, I love those eras that feel sort of kit bashed. That feel like, wait, how does this work? Like the 11th century is another one of those where you could have Vikings going to a Roman-style chariot race and also trading with Native Americans.
Yeah.
None of that is anything that we normally think of as at the same time. But you could conceive.
our video.
Little.
Feels like it is just completely kit bashed. You could conceivably have a Norseman who has met a Native American and has gone to a Roman-style chariot race in the Hippodrome of Constantinople and has looked at a castle that houses knights, all in the same period.
Sure.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. It is. And again, like, one of the interesting aspects to kind of loop it around to some of the topics that we started talking about was the fact that, you know, larger research institutions have the ability to have faculty specializing in a lot of different disciplines that, you know, can then create or assist new faculty to be developed and go out there and spread the word. So, you know, as, you know, history majors are approaching the end of their academic career with us and looking at other institutions of maybe I want to continue on to become a grad student, to become a professor myself, to kind of shop around and look at those different faculty disciplines that are present across not only the States, but also further abroad to see who can help me become the scholar that I want to become and study a specialty area that I'm already kind of interested in pursuing or a field that I haven't that I'm curious about. So very interesting stuff. History is one of those things where I was one of those students that was much more aligned and interested in literature courses growing up, but had kind of a tangential, okay, history's a thing. I thought it was relatively boring because, again, a lot of those coaches, I'm very thankful that my husband is a coach. In addition to being a history teacher, that he was always a history teacher first. And that's his passion and his love, and the sports stuff came on afterwards. And I mean, he's a tennis coach, so it's one of those things where he's not the head football coach by any means. But that is a pattern that we have discussed of, you know, history, social studies tends to be that field that when you're hiring a coach, if there's openings, that's where they tend to land. Other disciplines sometimes, but so it's always fascinating to me creating that love of history and the knowledge of history and curiosity about history has developed much more as I get older and have conversations with fascinating people.
Right. And I think that things that are just fascinating in general can then lead you to a more in-depth, rigorous study of history. We started this with me in my very professional historian voice, and in the last few minutes, I was talking about things that I find fascinating, not necessarily as a professional researcher, but they are really cool. And I've increasingly taken to trying to appreciate things like that, which is why I teach a history of magic class, where I try to keep both a scholarly dimension to say, here's how we can anthropologically and sociologically and intellectual, historically understand magic, but also these are beliefs people had, and they're really freaking cool.
Well, we have now reached to our running bit of where the guest can ask me a question. It could be anything. It could be what I studied, what are my interests, or you can ask for like a wild card where I could just talk about a random subject. I tell a random story. It could be from history. It can be from my family, which a lot of people like to hear. But any question.
So you are a history major, or you have a history degree.
I have a bachelor's in history.
How have you found that having a degree in history has influenced your understanding, not just of being a librarian, helping a researcher, but of the world at large, patterns of the way people work, even things like, I don't know, your favorite anime? Does having studied history help you with all of those things?
It really does. What I have noticed that it helps me in getting my master's. I'm in my last semester, and I will hopefully be graduating in May. But my ability to process information at such a volume and understand it and be able to write something within a short period of time is fascinating. On the downside of that is I know the ending of a book before I start it. Because Dr. Zimmerman told us that you can figure out what's going to happen at the end of the book within the first 5 pages. And I was like, oh, you ruined fiction for me. But it's fun now.
Yes.
But it greatly helps me with references. So that's when we help somebody find information like we use search terms and all that. Me having to come up with my own search terms while I was researching history into our databases really helps me with that. Even when it's not dealing with history. It can be nursing, it can be OTA, it can be anything. Another thing that it helped me professionally is with ILL. I'm the ILL person, and so when I have to go in and because sometimes people don't give me all the information I need. And then I have to go re-engineer it and go like, okay, this is what I need, this is what I need. Because for some reason, sometimes when they copy and paste the title, it just random symbols are in there. And it's like, I don't know what those are. And so I just have to find I use the date and then I use the author and I'm like, okay.
I hope I'm not too guilty of that. I usually check to make sure when there's an accent aigu or some other, or a CISA deal that it actually did paste. I hope I'm not too guilty of that.
And so for context for our audience, if you haven't watched any of the previous episodes where Zach has talked about what his current roles and responsibilities are, he is our Gill Express interlibrary loan specialist, periodicals specialist. So he works with a lot of those interlibrary loans when a person at MGA needs material that we don't have locally at our institution. Zach's the one who, along with a colleague at our Macon campus, who can put the request out into the larger library realm to see who else has those materials that they would be willing to loan for our patron, our person to use. So that can be articles. I think that's usually where a lot of the stickiness comes into. Our article requests from periodicals, magazines, journals, newspapers that we don't have a subscription to. We can get those for free, largely for free to the person from other organizations. We've even requested materials for faculty use from the Library of Congress. So, I mean, we have a pretty broad range of places where we can go to look for that stuff. But it does involve a little bit of a detective sleuthing that to be able to put those pieces together. So again, I agree that Zach's history background serves him very well in that role.
And I also notice things like more. I'm like, okay, this type of institution is more willing to give us this at a more expedient pace. Seminaries.
Yes.
Holy Lord. Yes. It's like before I even send the request in, I get it. I'm like,
very quick turnaround.
Yes. No, seminaries are also great for finding really obscure stuff. Like I remember when I was in grad school, and University of Toronto's best research library in Canada, there was one book they didn't have on the medieval doctrine of implicit faith, and it was a book in German, and they found it in a Western Pennsylvania seminary, and seminaries are absolutely great. You were great for finding Nicole Berrieux's book on 13th century preaching from St. Louis University, L'Avènement des Maîtres de la Parole.
Oh yeah, that book.
Yes.
I was like, I need to translate this.
And the people at SLU were very helpful as well. And Zach has been my absolute MVP when I'm trying to do scholarship, because a lot of things, as you might imagine, we don't necessarily have here in Middle Georgia State University. And Georgia's Gill Express system is great because I can get a lot of stuff from University of Georgia. But sometimes I will need something like a 500-page book in French on medieval preaching that not even University of Georgia has. And Master Brigmond here will start his detective work, and next thing I know, I get an email telling me that it's on the shelf waiting for me.
So sometimes, if it's necessary, I can go global. but the exchange rates are a little bit annoying.
Yes. Yeah. And then also the turnaround time as far as shipping goes.
Yeah.
That's also one of the considerations that one thing that a little tip I will provide to our listeners, if at all possible, the more specific that you can be in terms of if you've identified that there's a specific chapter in a book, we can usually request a copy of that chapter or section. If you don't need to review the whole
That can
thing.
be an article request.
Yes, exactly. That it's much easier, and we're much more likely to be able to obtain that on your behalf if it is a copy versus an actual full physical loan. So keep that in mind as you're researching and putting things out there.
Now, on the anime bit, I am an anime fan. I love anime. It's if I'm not watching a historical anime like Drifters, where they just, like I said, they took random people from different periods of history and just put them in a world. They isekai'd them. And but I also like applying different points of history in other animes that I'm watching, like Mobile Suit Gundam. That could be any colonial power fighting against an independent nation, a colony that wants to be independent. That could be Gundam. That could be actually no. The one that I'm writing right now, listening to right now, is called 86, and it's about a bunch of people who are different races, and your race is determined by your hair color and eye color. And they're being used as cannon fodder for an AI that is trying to destroy the world. But while I'm watching it, I'm like, oh, that's like the Singhalese Travailleurs. That's like all these different colonial units that were used as cannon fodder, especially in like World War One.
Right. Well, this one reason I really love Attack on Titan is because Hajime Isayama understands revanchist movements so well. You know, when the Eldians find out that they're Eldians, literally a week later, there's a revanchist movement.
Oh, yeah.
And that reminds me of like the Balkans, where you have these constructed historical myths.
Like after the fall of when I was going to when I thought about going and getting my master's, I was going to do the Balkans.
Yeah,
because it's fascinating that is a melting pot of vastly different cultures. But what's also interesting in the Balkans is that you can tell what group you're in by your religion.
Yeah.
The Croatians, most likely going to be Catholic. Serbs, you're most likely to be Orthodox. You're a Bosniak, you're most likely going to be Muslim. And how they work with each other. Like you'll have a village where they don't fight each other.
Well, I mean, the thing about the Balkans is, a friend of mine who's smarter than I put it, the Balkans is the great land of invented histories. Because of that 19th century nationalist impulse, what you'll have is people who've lived side by side for 7 freaking centuries. And then these people who are full of nationalist ideas that they've picked up by reading will then come and say that we have always hated these people.
Pesky books.
Seriously, I mean, this was actually one of my pet peeves in the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, is that media would talk about how, you know, Serbs and Kosovar Albanians have always hated each other. And then you look at how they've coexisted, and it's not until freaking Milosevic specifically turns up this ethnic resentment that you really see this. Like, ancient hatreds are almost always... I've grabbed the mic again. This was supposed to be the question for you.
No, that's fine.
But I mean, ancient hatreds are almost always a modern invention. Ancient hatreds, ethno-sectarian hatreds, usually, unless they're stoked and curated and maintained, usually die out. Which is why in the 20th century you usually have to reconstitute them or make them up out of whole cloth.
Yeah, reframe them.
Yeah. I mean, like, look at our racism ourselves.
Yeah.
In the United States.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that had to be like carefully curated.
Oh, yeah.
That had to be curated and maintained and reinforced, which it was.
Yeah.
But
and to look at the purposes behind that. The individuals, the groups that took that mantle up, reframed it, reshaped it, reintroduced it in a completely different narrative way than it may have originally been created.
Well, I think that racism in our context has changed differently. Like the racism that we're experiencing now is almost vastly different than what we see in Jim Crow. It's a lot more grassroots. It's a lot but the racism that we had when the transatlantic slave trade is vastly different as well.
Yeah.
It's just...
Well, I mean,
also had religious aspects into it as well.
Well, I mean, a lot of that goes back to colonial North America, looking to the way that race got constructed in New Spain and Peru, and that really traces its roots back even. Going to be the medievalist to get it, but a lot of that goes back to the way in both Al-Andalus and the Christian kingdoms of Spain,
with the Moors,
that you construct these identities and you have these rigidly policed social boundaries, and the idea of how that works can kind of carry forward, even though the values that you assign the outgroup. So outgroup might be Moors in New Spain, but then that outgroup can get slightly tweaked to be a racial rather than a religious other. But then, as you noticed, it becomes sort of, it can become grassroots rather than ideological, and the thing about these grassroots bigotries is I find them fascinating because they differ from ideological bigotries, but they can be harnessed because bigotries can just I don't like it, but they do kind of organically grow up, people being people. But then when you turn those into ideologies, that is when it gets deeply poisonous.
To me, bigotry is evolves from irrational hatred. Like, a guy, Jesus, stole my car. I hate Jesus.
Yeah.
Not, I hate all people from his culture.
Yeah.
That's what that should be. But instead, you're like, all people who are associated with Jesus are criminals.
And I mean, some of that
it's weird.
Okay, so I have precisely 2 semesters of undergraduate biology, and so now I am completely speaking from my nether parts. And yet, a lot of that also, fundamentally, I think, again, this is not me in my historian hat, this is me just my kind of guy talking hat, a lot of this seems to come from Dunbar's number. Are you familiar with Dunbar's number?
It doesn't ring a bell.
Dunbar's number is the idea that...
I'm thinking of Dooney.
No.
Dooney School.
Dunbar's number is the idea that you can conceptualize as complete people about 150 people. We've got the mental capacity to understand
I know what you're talking
people around us as fully formed people with hopes, dreams, fears, etc. And past about 150-ish, we then start to kind of turn people into, for lack of a better word, NPCs. I mean, we know they're around.
Just generalized.
But we don't necessarily think of, for example, the trash collector. We don't ask what his or her hopes, dreams, and fears are. We think, make the garbage go away person. And this is the case with most people we interact with. And because we really can only conceptualize about 150 odd people, bigotry often ends up, or kind of lumping people into categories like that, ends up being a cognitive shortcut that ends up being maladaptive.
Wasn't 150, wasn't that the number of people within like a tribal group in the Neolithic?
I mean, anthropologists divide the smallest group of people into bands, which is 150 to 200 people. At least I think they still do. Anthropology has changed a bit since I was an undergrad. But those smallest groups of people do seem to fit Dunbar's number. And so once you scale up to tribes, you have to invent a common myth. Like our tribe has a common ancestor, common family. And
we
then
sprout from the ground.
Yes. And then, of course, you get to states.
And
you have to come up with all of these workarounds. bureaucracy. Some might argue organized religion, bureaucracy, ideology. All of these things are workarounds to get past Dunbar's number.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Although I think we've gone way past our allotted hour because
fine.
I am constitutionally incapable of shutting the F up. And so
All right.
we should probably start wrapping up.
Yeah, well, all right, that's the end of the episode. Thank you for doing that. But we're definitely going to have you on for another episode.
Absolutely. It's been really interesting. Thank you.
It is fun. This is probably one of my favorite things that I've come up with.
The podcast.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So this is the end of the episode. Thank you for joining. Once again, Dr. Andrew Reeves. I said Annabelle Lee. I'm sorry.
Anne Williams.
She hates it when you call her Annabelle Lee.
Correct, because it's not her name.
You don't want to live in a kingdom by the sea?
No? All right. Thank you for coming, and see you in the next episode.